Hello and welcome to the presentation today from Informatica. This is the latest in a series of webinars throughout this year on reimagining data governance. And this particular webinar is going to look at the key to privacy by design. I'm Paul Garstang and I'm joined today by Steve Hollier, and we work with clients around Europe actually looking at in particular how they're putting GDPR into practice right now. And there's been a lot of interesting conversation that we thought would be a great topic actually for a conversation and debate today, and to look at also how Informatica positions itself in this space. So the key to privacy by design, an interesting title. What do you see right now and that's creating interest in this area?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question, Paul, and obviously everyone will have seen something like this slide before when they start looking at things. And one of the things that we're finding when our clients talk to us is that they want to use data. They're suddenly seeing data as a strategic asset. And some of the challenges around that is actually, well, hang on a minute, we want to use data for different purposes, for trend analysis, for better customer experience, for really understanding our business or driving the business forward. And the challenge is, of course, is that there's controls in place to be able to do that, and that's where the privacy aspects of it come in.
That's right. I mean, in some respects, business has been powering on, hasn't it, in recent years with data.
Absolutely.
And data is this new currency of business. And then after business has got started utilizing and exploiting data, along comes the regulation that says, just, well, hang on a minute.
That's right.
We need a few checks and balances here.
And there's also the other challenges. I'm use one of the other analogies, currency. I use oil, you use currency. See, difference already. But one of the things we'd like to look at is one of the other challenges they've got is what's going on. Why is it getting harder? And of course, we've got the expansion of the data volumes that are going through. Customers, clients these days don't have just little small databases with little data in it. They have documents, they have huge databases, they have client areas, they have lots of things going on that are increasing those volumes. There's also a new set of users that are coming through that actually want to be able to use that data in different purposes. It used to be that we used to have the sales teams doing it or the marketing teams doing it. We've now got business analysts trying to look at it. Data scientists are expensive to be able to do it. Testers want to be able to use it. Lots of people want to be able to use data these days. And of course, you've got the different data types that are coming through as well, the new connected devices that are coming through. I was only talking to a company yesterday that have got connected devices from information from cars, etc. And they can identify people quite literally by the registration numbers that are coming and the VIN numbers that are coming from those actual cars as well. So they've got to put privacy. And of course, one of the things we want to do, lots of companies we speak to are trying to move to the cloud. They're trying to move all their data into the cloud. They've got to have a process of actually managing the data that they're moving and putting some kind of privacy in play as well. And one last point, well, we all know it, machine learning. Everybody wants to do something with AI these days, or machine learning, and actually help them to be able to drive business or to get that competitive advantage in the marketplace. And so it's harder for companies to be able to manage their data as they're going forward.
I guess that has led really to an explosion in the locations that data is fed into.
That's correct.
Really, as well.
Yeah, it's spread out all over the place, and actually we don't just keep it within one silo anymore. We share information around through third parties, etc., and have feeds coming in from there. So it's important that wherever we're actually trying to use data or managing it, we're applying some kind of control to that as well. And of course, as we're showing here, there's also a number of regulations that are coming in play. So that point that you made earlier, which is hold your horses now, just make sure you've got some kind of control in play. Too many companies these days have gone, no, we can use the data, we're using it all over the place. We just this, and this. They're not applying any control, and actually we're finding there's growing enforcement. Obviously the key one within Europe is obviously GDPR, but we're not just seeing that sticking in Europe. What we've seen is it's gone over to Latin America, where they've got LGPD, it's going out to the States, where they've got CCPA. It's not stopping. There are a lot of regulations coming out there.
Okay, so a complex environment then.
There really is, yeah. And what we're finding is as well, companies are at a tipping point. 80% of the leaders are saying what they want to do. You can see there the first point is actually about cloud, moving to the cloud. They want to move all the data up there. They want to do a better customer experience. How can you do a better customer experience unless you see the data? How can you see the data unless you've got some kind of control in play? There's the BI initiatives and the analytics part of it. The trouble is, Paul, most customers don't actually know where the data is that they're supposed to be able to apply the controls to. And that's one of the big challenges that we're finding. So we talk to them about all the initiatives they want to do, but actually they don't know where to apply those particular initiatives.
Okay, so clearly then business is grasping the potential that data is delivering and seeing that they can transform the way that they currently engage with customers, the way that they go to market, position themselves in the marketplace, disrupt their market if they are a new arrival on the scene, and that data is really the keystone to being able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, if they don't get it right, just some of these charts you're seeing in here, some of the statistics, if they don't get it right, then their customer base is actually doing something about it. So you're seeing some of the big ones. We've got 83% of customers have stopped spending with 7 months of a breach coming through. These are statistics. So
83% of customers will no longer do business with an organization that has a breach.
That's what they're saying. That's what statistics are coming through. That's a big risk.
Well, that's nearly all of the business, isn't it? 83%. You don't have a business if you lose 83% overnight.
Yeah, it's in some respects it's irrelevant. Well, I say it's irrelevant, but it's one of the factors is obviously what the ITO and some of the commission officers will do. But actually your biggest problem is the brand image, is actually what your customers will do, because if they walk away, you have no customer base, and that's your business.
Yes, I suppose that's the true cost really, isn't it? It's not necessarily the fine, it's actually the impact on the business following the publicity.
Yeah, true. So we're talking about a couple of terms here, so I wanted to just do a level set on this. So we wanted to look at, okay, when we talk about data governance, what actually do we mean? Well, let's use the market term, or what they've said in just looking at Wikipedia. And data governance is a defined process an organization follows to ensure the high quality of data. Right? So it's managing data through its life cycle and documenting that part of it. A lot of customers these days, they're doing it through spreadsheets. Paul, how much do we love spreadsheets? And documenting on spreadsheets and Word?
Well, don't ask me for a spreadsheet.
Never find it. So we've got a process there around what we believe data governance is, but then we talk about two parts to it. We've got data privacy, and then data privacy as designed. So data privacy, okay, data privacy is how we use that data, how we manage it according to agreed processes that have been given to us. Data privacy as designed is making sure that we've got methods, right? So every time we deal with data in some way, we follow some kind of methodology to make sure that we are managing and protecting that data. And that's the two differences between actually, but they work hand in hand. So that's data governance, data privacy, and then making sure that data privacy is doing it by design.
Okay, I mean, that's an area that interests me. I spend a lot of time looking at privacy as a challenge to organizations, and I think that this whole term, privacy by design, has come into the marketplace now through the regulation. But what do people understand by it? What does it mean?
Well, let me ask you that question then, Paul. What do we think we mean by privacy as design?
Well, I think actually it's a journey to go on now. It's really a privacy culture that needs to be created. We need to embed processes really in business practice. This is not a one-off event. The change here that privacy by design speaks to when I think about it is that it needs to be a fundamental component of the design process for all business processes moving forwards. It's not an afterthought.
So why is that important?
So I think this time privacy has to stick.
Stick? What do you mean by privacy has to stick?
So, I've worked in this space for 20 years, and we've had regulations around data privacy before. And organizations, to some extent, I feel, have paid lip service to that. Not in a way which is deliberate, but in a way which makes convenience of process and cost become major decision-making criteria. there hasn't been a regulation in force which has had sufficient power to force this into the boardroom in a way which is meaningful. But also, I think that GDPR really is a regulation born out of necessity. GDPR was designed as a European citizen regulation. It only binds companies that deal with citizens of the EU. But already we've seen a huge move across the US to replicate the majority of what GDPR stipulates. Californian Consumer Protection Act is the first of those, but most states now in the US have their own version in preparatory works, and I think over the next 3 years we will see that most of the states will have some version of their own privacy regulations put in place. We're seeing the Latin American regulation start to come into effect next year as well. So this is actually a global move towards privacy. And I think that the reason that citizens are concerned about privacy now more than they ever were, which has precipitated these regulations, is because we're very much more aware as individuals how we do business with companies, how much information we input over the internet on a daily basis. There aren't many evenings go by where you don't sit at home watching TV, but at the same time you've probably got an iPad or your phone out and you're looking on Amazon, you're looking on eBay, you're joining societies, you're joining chat forums about products or hobbies that you're interested in, you're handing over your personal details to join those organizations, or you're doing business with those organizations. So the sheer volume of personal data that we as individuals put out there on a daily basis is immense. And with that, I think, comes this implicit expectation that those organizations will look after that data, that they will not compromise our personal security. That the internet actually works on a basis of trust. If we don't trust that transactions that we make are secure and don't compromise our financial details, then we would stop transacting over it. We can't burst that bubble.
So we talked to a number of customers around GDPR quite a lot, and obviously you and I have been quite global in what we do as well, so talking to others. A year on from, well, it's more than a year now, isn't it? It's nearly a year and a half on from GDPR. Have we seen many implement it, or what has been the driver? Has it been, from a privacy point of view, has the driver been regulation or customer, or what are we seeing?
The driver is customer, without a doubt. The driver is the customer. And the companies who are at the forefront of this are those who have brand reputation as a core plank of the differentiation in the marketplace. So for businesses in a highly competitive market, where the protection of that brand and quality of service that they deliver is their differentiation, then for me, those have been the organizations that have led the way on this one. I think since we saw the enforcement recently in respect of the British Airways incident from last year, that's a bit of a wake-up call for a lot of organizations as well, that this is actually going to be taken seriously by the regulator, and that the level of fines is of a magnitude which has no checker mark in history. This is different. I mean, you're out with clients on an almost daily basis. I mean, what are you seeing when you
yeah, so when I talk to businesses about they're trying to implement privacy as designed, what they're trying to do is make sure that they're yes, answering the regulator. That's obviously one of them. B, yes, helping their customer or getting a better customer experience too, because they want to make sure that the customer believes. In fact, I've got a couple of customers that put in their record of accounts that they look after the customer data. Some would argue that's a red flag to a bull for a hacker, but anyway, they do say that they look after that particular data. Some of the problems that they've got associated with that is that they've actually got too much data. They've got too much to deal with. They sometimes see it as too hard to implement privacy as design. Because remember, what we're trying to do is every time we do something with data, we should be thinking about the policy that should go along with that. So they've got to have a policy that's associated with that.
Okay.
They don't have documented processes there. And actually, from a banking point of view, if you look at the financial institutions, they believe they've done a lot of this. When have they done a lot of this? Well, they've had other regulations come down the line. So we've got the PII, PCI, DSS. We've also got things like BCBS 239. Those kind of things have already come down. So they've done some of it, but that's their core system. That's not necessarily all of their other customer systems or surrounding systems. So we're seeing that they're coming through. The biggest thing that they're asking for is, okay, that's great, we've got to do this. We want to do privacy as designed, we want to do all of this protection, etc. But we need to show value to the business. We need to get the business on board. So what can we do to, once we've done this, drive business value forward as well?
And so I mean, that's the crux of the challenge, really, isn't it? Is how we make it real inside the business. How do we actually put this into practice? So who are you seeing inside organizations and companies who are leading the charge on this one, who are taking responsibility for moving this forward?
So often the person that asks the question a lot is someone like the DPO or the compliance officer that's contained within there. The titles seem to be interchangeable of what they would be. The driver mainly is legal, right? So you've got legal contained within there. I always say to people I'm talking to, if legal aren't in the room, then you're really not taking this particular element of it seriously, because they're the ones that go define some of the policies or agree on some of the policies.
No, I agree 100%. I think this all starts with legal, to me. And if they didn't see that was their role, then somebody needs to say, look, I'm sorry, this is your role, because GDPR in particular is not a regulation that comes with a handbook of what you need to do in order to be compliant. So much of it is open to interpretation, and it needs the legal counsel, I feel, to look at those responsibilities and say, okay, what does this mean for us as a business?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. The other thing is actually making sure that business and IT are engaged together. I've actually been in customer conversations where business and IT are saying, this is your problem, no, this is your problem. And they're having an internal battle around actually whose problem it is. Yeah. Actually, fundamentally, it's both of their problems. Both of them are going to have to deal with it, get the information from each other. Let's face it, technical really understand the landscape, business understand how that landscape is being used. They have to come together to make this kind of process work, or to make privacy as designed work.
I mean, how are they doing it? What are some of the things that they're putting in place?
Well, let's look at a typical example, right? So you mentioned GDPR. I don't want to harp on about GDPR too much, but it's the easy one to pick from a regulation as we
right, and it is, where the phrase privacy by design
comes from,
originates as well.
Well, yeah. So if we look at it, we've got the compliance officer and the GPO contained within there, and they look at GDPR, but they've got a question mark over it. What they want to do is actually go to the legal department. The legal department are going to want to document what that actually means to them. What can they stand up and say, this is, if the ICO comes to us, so the Information Commission Officer, comes to us and actually says, you have broken this, they need to be able to stand up and say, no, we've answered it based on what we believe in our interpretation. So they will start to define out some of the policies that are associated with it. You've got to have a place to actually document that. So you're going to have business start to document some of those policies, those processes, etc., of how the data landscape that we've started to talk about is being used, and incorporate that somewhere. IT is obviously going to have to be involved. IT is going to have to find that information. So once business describe what is key to them from an asset point of view and what is lockered, then IT and privacy teams are going to have to go out there and try and find it and understand it from there too. We go around the circle. Once they've found it, actually coming back to business or system owners or application owners, whichever you call them, they're actually going to have to apply the information that you've then found to the policy that you've defined within the actual system that you've got here. So in the center there, you've got the policies that we've got based on the regulation. Then going to the next step, we're going to have to do something about it. Based on the policies that we've defined in those particular repository, it might be that we remove they found data in a non-production environment, right? So credit card information contained within there. You might decide that you're going to remove it. In a production system, some of the data is exposed to people who shouldn't be able to see it, right? It's broken the particular policy. You're going to have to put some access in play. And there might also be a case with pseudonymization or masking to make sure that you're masking that data too. But whatever it is, it's been defined in this particular repository to say, based on these requirements or based on this regulation, we will do this particular enactment. And that's really quite key. And that doesn't stop there. You spoke to GDPR quite happily. There's also BCBS 329, there's IFRS 17, there's a number of regulations that are sitting out there as well. So it's going to go back to, okay, we've got this challenge, let's document what we need to do, and then it will follow that ongoing cycle. And that's the really important thing, is what we need to do is make sure we're going round in circles each time with the data and applying the particular policy to each time we find data that's associated with it. And we can't just do it as a one-off process. I've seen too many customers that will actually do this scanning exercise or this policy exercise, and then they'll sit down and go, yes, I've done it, I've finished, that's me done for the day, I can go home. But actually that's not the case, because the business landscape never stands still. It's constantly moving. Data, as we've very much pointed out, is a strategic asset. If it's a strategic asset, I can guarantee you that it's being used. And therefore this has to be a continual process going through and making sure that all of that data and all that information that we've done has privacy added to it by design.
And privacy by design for me is saying that this becomes part of the culture of the business.
And that's true. That's very true.
It's not just a part of a project. It is actually how we do business as an organization. So thinking about privacy, thinking about the data that will be part of the project, and the exposure that that data will have as we put the infrastructure together needs just to be part of the thought process.
Yep, agreed.
I'm still not seeing this right now, I have to be honest with you. I had an organization come to me last week. They were about to start loading data into the test environment for a data lake. They had acquired the technology to move the data, to house the data lake, to do the reporting, to do the mastering, but it was only when they started to load the data into the test environment for the data lake that they suddenly thought, oh, hang on, we've got customer data here, and I'm sure we're not allowed to have it in the test region. And they had no provision for removing the sensitive data from the test. So it's still not a part of the core thinking. I think privacy around production is probably more advanced, but some of the, what I would call the beneath the surface IT processes, thinking about privacy in the context of those, I think still has quite a way to go at the moment.
Yeah, I agree with you in that non-production environment. We also see it in production, so very same different customer, but same process. They were taking data out of their production systems and moving it into Snowflake, ironically, which is one of the NoSQL DBs sitting up in the cloud. And what their plan was they wanted to run massive analytics across it, which I get, right, from a privacy point of view. But they were taking all that information from a number of core systems. Those core systems had all that protection, that policy in place for the user access to that data, and then they're applying it and dumping it into, dumping is maybe the wrong word, but it's a good word to use. They're putting it into Snowflake to allow them to be able to see all that information around analytics credit. Great. But they've taken it away from all the controls, right?
Yeah.
And they haven't applied any of the controls that they had in place from those core systems.
Yeah.
So they came back to the drawing board and said, no, from a privacy as design point of view, we need to understand the information that we've got, which actually leads us very nicely, Paul, so I think to the kind of 6 steps that we think about when we kind of go through this. And how can Informatica really help to get people to have privacy as designed?
Yeah, I think it's quite right that we should talk about that, because this is really what we are talking about with clients, is how can Informatica help them on this journey.
And these are just thoughts, right?
Yeah, and these are the basic things, really. These are the where should we get started steps, I think, for most organizations. But once we've had that feedback from legal, which is something that has to be done internally, of course, that interpretation, those viewpoints from legal need to be turned into policies and processes, procedures, and they need to be centralized. They shouldn't be the data privacy officer's filing cabinet, so that actually we have decided how the business we're going to do this, and then that's gone to an individual, but then there's no exposure of those policies and processes and no embedding of them in the core culture of the company.
No, you have to be able to see it.
Exactly. So centralizing that, but then having workflow and connectivity into where it's been centralized I think is the critical point of being able to embed it into process design so that everything flows through this central governance policy process. Once we have that in place, we then need to actually start with some of the mechanics in the background. And the first one of those I always think is you need to understand your data landscape. You need to understand where the sensitive data sits inside the organization. You need to understand whose data it is. You need to know whether we have combinations of data in certain locations that make those a higher risk than others. And therefore, they trigger one of the policies and processes that we've defined from legal. And if that's the case, we then need to do something proactive. So we then need to be pushing out a protection measure, whether that be removing access to some of that data because this is of a sensitive nature beyond the entitlement of that individual, or maybe that individual is offshore, for example. We have a policy in place that says that offshore personnel do not get access to this kind of information. Or maybe we remove it altogether from that location. Maybe there's no actual business process need for that sensitive data to be there. It's just convenience because we've taken a copy of a production instance, but actually we do need a filter in place. So we need some masking to change that sensitive data to make that copy of the data no longer sensitive. And then it can go offshore. Then we can share it with our business partners. So it's about defining those policies and centralizing them. It's about understanding our sensitive data landscape. And then it's about enacting the policies and processes that flow from that. I think that's really where Informatica can help.
Yeah, and I think there's one of the things as well, you pointed it out quite rightly, which is actually you need to think about the two sides. So I talked about this argument that goes on between business and IT, and you can see why that might be the case. Because, of course, business want to use the data and know how that data is being used. IT just have those physical assets or understand those physical assets under the cover and obviously want to protect it without really understanding how the business use that data, which is quite an interesting scenario. So what we tend to find is there's two parts you need to look at as part of this. We like to call them top-down, bottom-up approaches, and you can go either way, right? We kind of said it's a two-step process and went from one to the next, etc. But you can kind of go either way, starting at the bottom-up or the top-down as we start to go through this. So if you look at this one, you've got the physical models. So you want to discover what data, how can you apply, how can you manage privacy of design, how can you do privacy unless you actually know what you've got, where it is, where it flows to. So you're mapping out that physical understanding of your data landscape, which is really quite important, how it's being used, who accesses those kind of things. But the next thing you've got to be able to do is then from a top-down approach, you've got to define, okay, what policy should be applied to those particular bits of data? What does it mean by those data? What are the definitions? Obviously, from a technical point of view, they might see a column, and it might just have XXXXX as the column name. Well, what the heck does that mean to anybody?
Yeah.
They've got to have some kind of definition that says, okay, XXX happens to be an email address. I would never have known that from the metadata information or the terms. I always talk about a particular customer that we spoke to that looks for D number. D number apparently is an industry term. Well, it's an industry term to that particular line of business. When we got out into the marketplace, actually, it's not an industry term in any way, but they are so used to it. Other lines of businesses called it something else, completely different. So it's making sure that we're sharing that information. Also, every time that they have a touch point with data, what policy should they be adhering to? So for GDPR, as you rightly said, making sure that I've got a credit card information here, or I've got a name here, or I've got an address here. How should I apply the particular policy that is associated with that for protecting that data, that I'm using that data in the right manner, which is down to the privacy bit that we talked earlier. Okay.
So how do you do that then from the top-down way?
So that's defining that policy. So put back to what we showed before, right? So taking on that part of the GDPR, taking on BTS 229, taking on that policy aspect of it, you can start documenting it. We start looking at, okay, the top-down approach into this. So for Informatica, we have a technology called Axon contained within there. I am not planning on going into a sales spiel here. I just want to say this is what we use from a documentation bit of library, and what you need to think about are some of the bits that you can put in here, making sure that you put governance or the business are able to see the information at a touch point, right? So they can sharing it. What you were talking about earlier, centralizing that view, centralizing that understanding, you can centralize it in one particular place.
Okay, which to me is the key actually here. is making sure that this is a common component when we start a project.
Yeah.
That all projects reference this repository so that they understand what their responsibilities are in the context of the sensitive data that they have identified they have.
Yeah, and in our particular case, we call them facets. So a facet might be, for example, a data set. A data set might contain, an easy one to always use is credit card. Okay, if I go on credit card within the business, what policy should I be adhering to, and what do I need to do with that particular bit of data? So whenever I see credit card, this is the policy that I should be applying, be that GDPR, be that PCI DSS, whatever I should be doing. That enables you to be able to do that privacy as design each time you see that particular data element. Other parts that you need to be able to do is make sure you've got those business definitions that we talked about. There's some business context, there's rules and workflows for change management, making sure you're having that coming through. There's lineage. And what's really important, which we've harped on about quite a lot, is actually that centralization, making sure that it's open for everybody to be able to see that when they do something, when they have a touch point of data, this is what you should be doing, following that circular process as we start to go through. But that's only one aspect of it, right? We've spoken about that top-down approach, but what about the bottom-up, Paul? How could you deal with the bottom-up aspect?
Okay, so for me, in my realm of the privacy side, I do often start with that discovery process. And we do, of course, have a discovery capability here at Informatica. It's called Secure at Source. And actually, in the next webinar in this series on the 18th of September, we're going to be looking at this in much more detail. But the fundamental purpose of this is actually to give us a business as usual way of understanding the content of the data sources that we are touching. So prior to this leap in technology, the only way that organizations really mapped their data was either to do one-off profiling steps, system by system, database by database, quite time-consuming, weeks we're talking actually, to profile properly a system and document what data content is in that system. But then typically that is spreadsheeted. You know, here are a list of the applications, here are the databases that sit behind those applications, and here is a list of the sensitive data elements that are resident in those databases, and here is the owner of that particular system, literally on a spreadsheet. But of course, the business, the way that data flows through the business, the systems, that data is flowing by the second. So the content of those systems is maybe not changing by the second, but it has the potential to change by the second because of the flow of data that's moving between the systems. And we're adding new platforms, we're adding new analytical platforms, we're adding new responsibilities or new views or new requests from the business into these platforms all the time. But the previous audit step around what sensitive data we have is not being continually updated. It can't be, because that's too onerous a process. That was a process that took 6 weeks. So that doesn't scale. That's not fit for purpose for GDPR, and it doesn't meet the requirements that legal have set out in terms of our responsibilities for protecting adequately the sensitive data that we have. So we have to go to the next generation of technology, and that's what this is that we'll talk about in the next webinar. It is scanning those data sources for the presence of particular types of data and continually updating dashboards that give us insight. So it's giving us insight into what sort of data is being held, which data stores it's in, which data stores are populating downstream systems with sensitive data, what the potential risk associated to that data is based on the value that the data might have, the number of times that users access it, the number of downstream systems that it populates, the potential commercial cost, the location of the data. So all of those factors taken into account. Combinations of data is perhaps the most important, to be able to identify systems where if a breach were to take place, actually an individual's identity is compromised. It's not just the name or an email address, but actually within that single data store, we might have the name, the date of birth, and an address all of the key factors that we would use to identify an individual, and if we had them, we could purport to be that individual in a commercial transaction. So that's the information that this is providing almost second by second.
But it's providing it to that top-up, top-down approach, right, as well? So this isn't just one view. You get the two views come together, don't they, so that you can overlay it. Is that right?
Yes, well, but what it's giving you, though, is the insight to be able to apply the right policies and processes.
Absolutely.
You know which policies need to be applied because you've got the facts at your disposal about what sensitive data we have and the movement and the exposure of that sensitive data. So where is it? How is it moving? Who has access to it? Where are those users? That's the information I need to be able to put together the right privacy and protection plan around that data.
So it's just two different lenses of looking at the data, but actually they can both use, it's interchangeable because they're passing information flow between each other. Okay, I like that too. Okay.
Yeah. And then the other aspect is to be able to actually do something proactive with that view if we're triggering a policy. So I have sensitive data, it's in a location where perhaps I don't want all of the users to have access to it because I have some onshore customer advisory staff who need access to the data, but I might have some offshore system support staff, for example. So my policy says that I should not be exposing this type of data to individuals who are offshore or who are in a role where their role does not require them to see the data. I mean, some of the easy use cases are in healthcare, for example.
Yep.
But equally, in many organizations, what we would rather not do is expose just date of birth and simple customer details because we wouldn't want our data to be exposed. So then to be able to put together protection policies that say for those individuals, based on their role, based on their location, you don't get to see that data. And to have physical tools in place. So again, this is something that we'll talk about in the next session, but Informatica has a range of tools that can protect both production systems, so that regulating the view, but also in non-production systems, removing, well not removing, but I would say replacing the sensitive data with like-for-like non-sensitive values so that we remove all the sensitivity for that particular data store, particularly in testing and development, those kind of abuse.
So what you're saying is actually we've got the capability to define what the policy will be, also to find the data that might be associated with those particular policies, but then we can enact on that. So you're really getting the full circle of understanding it, documenting it, finding it, and then enacting on it as we go through. So you're really implementing that and giving the culture a chance to be able to think about how to implement privacy as designed.
But embedding these steps, isn't it? They're not complex steps. They're really quite simple.
It's giving them the information.
It's about understanding what our responsibilities are. It's about passing that interpretation down to the business. That then creates policies and processes. We centralize those. We allow the business to have access and visibility to them. We look at what sensitive data we have, and then we put the policy in place for that type of data. And that's really what we're talking about here. That's how I think privacy by design moves into that next step of being part of who we are in respect of our data. This is just the way we do business.
Make it easy for business to understand what they should do with the data that they've got contained within the systems they do. Okay, very good.
Absolutely.
Okay, so
we kind of summarised that almost.
we did as we talked it through,
yeah.
So as I've rightly said, making sure you understand that regulation. Regulations they're not going away. They're here to stay, and actually they're only going to get worse. Some of the companies who speak to, obviously, I think have kind of put GDPR some bit on the back burner a little bit, and being driven by other things, and data governance as a term, etc., has come out in there. But it's here to stay. So you're going to have to understand that regulation. You might as well start documenting it so that you know what policies you've got in play, so you've exposed it to the business so they can enact on it based on their design and privacy as design elements. Centralize that documentation library. Allow access for all. I find it too hard sometimes when I get a bit of information to go, what do I do with that bit of information? I don't know what policy I should be applying to it. Make it available so that people are able to go, I've got this bit of data, I want to create this particular system. What am I meant to do with it? So you're almost embedding it into the culture as you go through.
Yeah. understand the sensitive data landscape is absolutely critical, and then apply the policies. We've said that on several occasions now, but that's really where this hits the road. It's not the policy creation, it's not the discovery step, it's actually them going down and implementing the policy, putting that into the architecture, embedding the protection method that is appropriate to that type of data. If we're going to have this across the business, then the processes that we put in place must scale as well. So I think one of the choke points from the past being that the methodology is used to follow this flow, because it has been done before for certain critical customer platforms, but the reason it hasn't scaled is because too many of those processes have had too much manual work. Mm-hmm. There's been too much hand cranking of these processes. So the discovery step is a classic example. Profiling, it doesn't scale. And as it doesn't scale, people don't use it because the information is out of date and isn't felt to add value to the next project, and they're not prepared to foot the bill for a new profiling project. So automate the discovery, automate the policy management, automate disbursement of that policy management. Give your company, give your organization the ability to scale this, and then you embed it into how we do business. That really is what I think is the key to an intelligent data governance and privacy solution. Privacy by design, I think.
Fantastic. Okay, well, we've kind of gone through that. One of the things we'd just like to highlight is we've got some new webinars coming up. So we've got three parts to this. The first part was an introduction into that. Then up next, we've got GDPR, the gloves are off, which I believe, Paul, you're managing on the 18th of September, is that correct?
Yes, and that speaks to the recent developments around enforcement that we all saw a few weeks ago, which was it took us all by surprise. I think the level of fine that was issued, and I think that is a game changer. GDPR is clearly not going to be fake news. I think that's the message the regulator wanted to get out. Their gloves are off. They've given fair warning. We're 12 months down the line, and now they are ready to deliver on what they said that they would deliver. And I think for a lot of companies, that's a big wake-up call. That period of grace had started to look like actually the regulator had no teeth, and they had bigger concerns, but actually they were just giving people the time that they said they would do, and assuming that companies would carry out the work that they said they would do in the background. So now we're going to have a look at how we actually get moving on this. If for some reason you haven't actually already done it.
Great. And then the final one, which I'll be managing at the end, is about fueling your business outcomes. So basically taking what Paul is showing, what we talked about a little bit today, and then helping that and taking that information and how it can drive your business initiatives going forward, and actually speed them up in a lot of respects for time delivery, because you now know where that information is. I've been working with some data scientists in the background who are looking for data sets of information, and they spend so much time looking for it that actually they're an expensive resource, would you believe? And most of their time is spent in data prep. Well, why do we need to spend so much time in data prep? If you can document it, if you can manage it, if you can show them where that information is, you save them so much time, and then actually they can go on with other projects in the background. So I'm going to go through that. We haven't yet set a date for that one, but that will be coming through as part of this webinar series in October. Okay. I guess the next part will be whether there's any questions that have come through, and have we seen any questions come through, Paul?
There's a couple of questions that we have here. I think one actually we've covered off quite well, which was just where would you start? And I think we've talked about legal really. I mean we've talked a lot here about the IT processes, but for me it starts with legal. If we go off without having legal determine what actually the company's responsibilities are, then we clearly run the risk of a legal team making a judgment downstream that is contrary to the strategies that we've deployed, and it's just not worth it. So let's get them involved in the conversation straight away, get the interpretation, get clarity of what do in respect to this regulation, and then we can start to put that into practice.
I think there's also the point where you're going to have to show, and back to what I'm saying about customers and stuff, they want to see value. And so many customers, what they want to do is implement something so quickly into there. And so they're trying to do the big bang approach. The big bang approach frankly doesn't work. What you need to do is think about a project, whether that be a particular CRM system or something along those lines, show value to the business up front, right? So yes, apply the policy, do the data governance, do the scanning, and all the stuff that we've spoken about, and then get some real business value out of it. And that's what we tend to work with our customers with, to show mini projects that will get that value. So start small to be able to scale fast is what we're trying to do.
Okay, interesting. And then the last question I have here is from a viewer who is companies on a cloud-first agenda. So they're just interested really in how this hits the road when what they're doing is they're moving their data off-premise, really. Is there an impact here? And really, I suppose what they're driving at is, to some extent, they're handing over the management of a lot of applications to a third party. Are they handing over responsibility in this area as well, or do they still have their responsibility?
No, of course they still have responsibility, and therefore they're still going to have to document it. It depends on the contract that has been defined with the provider that you're putting the data into. Obviously, a provider is going to provide sometimes a bucket. The bucket is there, and they'll maintain the bucket and probably some security around that part of it. But you still own the data. You're still the owner of that particular data, and therefore you have to apply the policy. So you still find that you're responsible for it, and manage it in exactly the same way as you would have on-premise data as well.
I think what I'd say to clients is that, well, just imagine you have a breach. Who does the customer blame? And the answer is, they blame you. Their relationship is with you. They're not interested in the fact that you have a cloud-first strategy and you've got your platform on a cloud infrastructure. So they gave you your data, they've entrusted you with safeguarding it, and it's you they will hold accountable.
Yeah, and one of the questions that's coming from the marketplace is around how much money has been saved. These are really hard and tricky ones to actually done. We've got a number of statistics around actually how much percentage they. So one of the examples I gave was around a telco, and a telco has done a 50% increase in customer satisfaction, basically because they understood that where that information was, the requirements and things like that. Physical numbers, we're working on those parts of it. A lot of people are in early journeys in this particular part, but we are getting percentage increase of how they are increasing their work ethics and stuff. So I gave that data scientist one. These are true numbers. I actually had a data scientist arena that I found that they had 80%, in fact it was 85% in the end, 85% in the data prep arena and 15% in the actual data analysis arena, and we managed to get that down to it was a 40. So they're 20% in data prep and 20% in actual analysis, which would be 60% they could actually then do for other projects. And that's an amazing statistic that might come through. No real hard numbers yet, but they're coming through slowly as we're seeing it too.
Yeah, and I think what I've heard listening to particularly data governance officers speak at some of the events that we've held is the benefit of doing this once and centrally for the organization is that as these individual project teams spin up, they don't have to think about this. The governance of data and how that data is treated, and when they take data from this source and it's loaded into the test regions, for example, it's already been anonymized because it's part and parcel of how the company does business. So they don't have to think about it. They don't have to spend downtime in their projects. They don't have to allocate resource. It's already been done. So the governance is democratizing the ability for organizations to harness the data that they have, safe in the knowledge that the regulatory compliance elements have already been taken care of. So there's a lot of deduplication, but also, of course, the flip side for the business is that it's been done according to the plan as well. It's not left to individual project teams to interpret how they're going to put this into effect. It's been done centrally, it's been done once, it's been done right.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to put figures on it, but that's clearly where the benefit to business comes.
And you're right about the centralization, so another point comes in around how the board might be able to add data definitions or strategy in there too. And actually, the idea of the centralization is that it's access for all. So therefore, you can do. It's not just the legal team. They will define the policies. They're the ones that have to stand up in front of the ITO. Actually, funny enough, so do some of the board members as well. But if you want to apply those particular bits that the board are saying, there's change process that you can go through. They can document that part in those particular arenas too as well, and especially around data definitions, because often legal won't necessarily know what is a key bit of data that we need to manage or maintain as part of the privacy of design. That might come from the business owners, it might come from the board, it might come from a number of different people, but it's centralizing it and opening it up for all to apply to it. You'll have different things, so you won't want everybody to be able to edit and add that information. You'll want change control in there. So the purpose of data governance is to make sure you've got control. So you'll actually want to have the ability that only a few people can add, and then other people might, document or change or request information or add to that bit of information without physically being able to change it unless it's been through an audit process.
Okay, and that completes the questions. So I'd just like to say on behalf of Stephen and myself, thank you very much for joining us today for this webinar, and we look forward to speaking to you again on the 18th of September when we have the second in this short series. So thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.